So, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was directed by Francis Lawrence and it stars Tom Blythe, Rachel Zegler, Peter Dinklage, Jason Schwartzman, and Viola Davis. And this movie taking place over 60 years prior to the first Hunger Games book and movie. Coriolanus Snow is a mentor to some of the Hunger Games tributes, particularly this one in District 12 known as Lucy Gray Bird, played by Rachel Zegler. And he must, try to help her win in various ways possible, and basically it takes a turn for the worse and how he slowly is going to become the future ruler of Panem. So was a movie that honestly I was not looking forward to too much. I remember getting into the Hunger Games when it was like, in movies and such, and I was aware of it and I was getting interested, like started reading the books and such, so I wasn't like really into it. Like I remember being obsessed with Harry Potter, never really obsessed with Hunger Games. So I read the books and watch the movies, like kind of just get into it. I will say Jennifer Lawrence carried the movies for the most part, but I feel like they started off okay, got better with Catching Fire, and then Mockingjay happened, and I'd rather forget it. So I was not looking forward to this too much, even though there are some cast members where I'm like, what are you doing in this movie? I still gave it a chance because, like, why not? It has the same director involved with this franchise, so might as well give it a chance. And this movie mainly hinges on whether or not you love this franchise. If you absolutely love the Hunger Games franchise, you're going to love this movie. If you hate this franchise, you're going to hate this movie. And if you're kind of indifferent to this franchise like me, you're probably going to feel indifferent about this movie overall. So, are there things that work in this movie? Yes, there are. I do like seeing the look of Panem in this movie, kind of like before it kind of becomes like this whole ruin in the later Hunger Games series, and like you know what I mean, like in the original trilogy and such. Some of the actors, admittedly, I do think do a good job. Tom Blythe does a pretty good job at being this character who's like slowly like doing like awful things and kind of like even though he thinks he's doing good, he's like doing really bad things overall. I do think his character is very interesting. Viola Davis in this movie kind of surprised me because her character is so ridiculous and so over the top. I'm surprised you would take on a role like this, but like she kind of just walks that line between being absolute corny and absolute evil. It's like it actually does work overall. As far as like anyone else, the only person who kind of stood out to me was Mackenzie Lansing as another tribute who I thought they were very terrifying. Not necessarily terrifying, but like definitely intimidating enough to the point where I'm like, yeah, I would not want to be in this game with you because I would probably just run away from you. Honestly, when it gets into the actual Hunger Games themselves in the second act, this movie's actually pretty solid. I do think it's like that's kind of what I expected from this franchise, actual Hunger Games stuff, not like all this political BS. But when it actually gets there, and it does take a while to get into that, I'll get into that later, but it's definitely fun to watch. And I do think the chemistry between Tom Blythe and Rachel Zegler is actually really good. You actually do believe them in this relationship and friendship and such at first. And I would even argue they had more chemistry than Katniss and Peeta did in the Hunger Games franchise. So, what don't I like about this movie? Well, let's start off with Rachel Zegler. I felt like her character was just not very well written. It was, I didn't read this book, but I guess her character's not really that well defined in this movie either, and she's not really well defined in the book. So her character, she's a singer. It doesn't really explain like how she got into the Hunger Games other than just the reaping ceremony and such. Like she has this dress at one point where it's like that is a gorgeous dress. How did you get that together? Like did you make it? It's never explained. It seems really fancy for your district, which is like the poorest district. It doesn't really make any sense. Also, her accent kind of just goes in and out at first. Like at first, she kind of has a southern accent, but then it kind of like goes away for the most parts until she starts singing. There's a lot of music in this movie, surprisingly, and not just a score and such. Is like actually her singing. She was great in West Side Story. I'll give her that, and that's probably why they have it in this movie too. Also, the movie does get a little too melodramatic, honestly, which shocker. It's not particularly good. Like there's a couple scenes with Peter Dinklage where he's like clearly overacting, and it kind of just doesn't call for it. There are also so many pacing issues. Recently, Francis Lawrence was like, "Yeah, I shouldn't have split Mockingjay into two parts." This movie kind of shows like why maybe some things should be split into two parts because like this movie, it tackles so much, and it's also the longest Hunger Games movie because like in each act is kind of just different from each other. Like the first act is like the setup to the Hunger Games, the second act is the Hunger Games, and third act is the Fallout. It's like I think it may be a little too much, honestly. And I just feel like the second act is probably the best of the three acts. The third act is kind of interesting, and also the first act is kind of just, all the exposition stuff. So it just kind of doesn't work overall as like it doesn't work in a cohesive flow. Honestly, also there are so many underdeveloped characters, like Coriolanus has a sister or cousin or something like that. Again, I didn't read the book. So I felt like it's like, okay, what are they going to do with that relationship? Nothing. Okay, so there's this other tribute, this other person who's like training the tributes. What's he going to do? I guess he's going to do this in the third act. Doesn't really matter too much because, like, I never really felt that relationship between those characters, honestly. And again, I feel like the first act is kind of boring, and the third act is just kind of like, it's just like I'm just racing to the end. Like, I was just checking my phone, I was like checking the time, and like, just end this already. I feel like it's already too much as it is. And also, I think the movie has way too many Easter eggs. Like, I kind of don't like it when prequels do Easter eggs because like it just kind of takes away from the rest of the movie. And some of the Easter eggs in this movie are just so obvious that they made me roll my eyes. There's like a scene where they're like talking about flowers and like, well, they called this a Katniss, and I'm like, ugh, come on, you can do better than that. So I honestly, again, if you love this franchise, you're definitely going to love this movie, and if you hate this franchise, you'll definitely hate this movie. But again, if you're like me, you can kind of look at it and see like what you do like from this franchise and other things you don't really like. Yeah, it's not really going to change your opinion one way or the other. So even though there's some good performances and good visuals and good production values, and even though the second act is admittedly better, and I do think the chemistry between the two lead stars is definitely really well done, I do think that Rachel Zegler's character is not really that interesting. At least in the original Hunger Games franchise, at least Katniss, had a bow and arrow, and she was really good with hunting and such. But her like it doesn't really make too much sense. Also, it's just very melodramatic. There's so many pacing issues. I just kept looking at the time throughout the entire time I was watching it. Feels like three different movies in one. It's a movie that honestly I just didn't care about, and honestly I shouldn't have expected anything better. I'll give The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes 2 out of 4 stars straight. So, are you a fan of the Hunger Games franchise? Which is your favorite book or movie? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. May the odds be ever in your favor.